A year ago today, we were looking at the theme of art as activism. And while the conversation has shifted, I think we're still very much within that framework. However, it seems as though 2017 has fed further polarization and divisiveness into our communities. And this year, I encourage us to take time and to take pause to look at where we can transform these perceptions of division. Here at Montalvo, we have an institutional commitment to bring community together for critical dialogue pertinent to our world, to foster cross-cultural connections, and to be a catalyst for the incubation of empathetic, compassionate, and creative solutions to the challenges across our community. I can think of no more necessary and urgent conversation to have, and I can think of no more appropriate a group to participate in that conversation than artists, educators, and community leaders in our region. For our professions, we may very well be the best suited to substantially change the narrative for both today and tomorrow. I can also think of no more fitting keynote than Jeff Chang. We are so deeply, deeply honored that he has accepted our invitation to join us today and that he's setting the context for our time together. Jeff is a prolific writer, award-winning author, and the executive director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University. He is a profoundly inspiring voice for looking critically at the issues that plague our communities most. And I'd like to ask you now to help me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much to Montalvo as well. And can we get an amen, another amen for Venus Jones, please? Amen. And an even more powerful a woman. A woman. I just want to let you know, I'm going to tip my card a little bit here, tip our card a little bit. Venus will be coming back this afternoon. And so just, if you're feeling it, which I know you all were, definitely let her know, right? Definitely let her know. It's wonderful to be able to be here today, to be with you all who are doing so much in this moment of great urgency. I think that we are in a situation that requires a lot of us, and so my main feeling has been to try to be out and be in community with folks as much as I possibly can, because it's so important, I think, for us in this particular moment to be able to recognize the kinds of things that we need to do, and also to be able to be sure that we're checking in with each other, to sustain each other, to share good ideas, and to be able to move forward together. And so that's the spirit that I'm coming to today. Let me see if I can make this work here. Oh, here we go. So let me start here and say that last year, or actually 2016 now, I published a book called We Gonna Be All Right. And it's not coming up, but the main thing to say is that this particular book, called We Gonna Be All Right, was written and published before the election. Yeah, and so the book began with Donald Trump, which I'm sure if you knew would make him really happy until he read it. And the book ended with Beyonce because after Beyonce, there's really nothing left to say. But after the election, of course, I got a lot of messages like, Jeff, are we really going to be all right? And the book is in a lot of ways about the ways that we've resegregated ourselves over the last half century. It's a process that's unfolded, sometimes quietly, sometimes very, very loudly, but a period during which we've dismantled the structures that were pushing us towards racial equity and cultural equity. And the fact that those structures have been dismantled has brought us into this very fraught historical moment. So I have to admit to you that it's been incredibly difficult to be out there talking about a book called We Gonna Be All Right, when daily it feels like there's evidence that's being presented to us on the contrary. But if you think about the song that gave the book its name, All Right by Kendrick Lamar, It's a song in which he's presenting, for the most part, in all the verses, the story of his struggle as a young black man growing up in South Los Angeles, living daily, trying to get through every day in South Los Angeles. And it's a very, very difficult type of struggle that he's trying to portray. And then he gets to the chorus, and it seems like he pulls out of the air these lyrics that suggest that if God's got you and me, and we've got each other, then we're going to be all right. And so it's a leap of faith. It's a leap of imagination. It's a light in a moment of darkness. And it's a reminder that our imagination can outlast the darkness that we're facing, and sort of show us the way towards a brighter day. And it feels like we need that now more than ever, right? We're living in a time that's polarized, that's divided. The culture wars have intensified over the past decade. And these culture wars are, in a sense, a struggle over the soul of America, of who we are. It's a clash of competing narratives, a story of a great America that we're in danger of losing forever versus a story of a more hopeful emerging America. The end of American civilization or the beginning of a great national transformation. And so these culture wars have now poured into the streets, and they've exacted a body count. And they leave us wondering how we're going to make sense of it all. They leave us worried about where we're going. So let's start by acknowledging that all the polls show that we're more concerned now about race than at any time since about 25 years ago, right? The Los Angeles riots. And the previous spike in concern around race relations went all the way back to 1965, over a half century ago. 65 was the year of Selma. It was the year that the civil rights movement peaked. It was the year, not incidentally, that the Voting Rights Act was passed and the National Endowment for the Arts was chartered. It's also the year that the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. It was the year of the last consensus for racial justice and cultural equity in this country. It's been over a half century since we've had a national consensus pushing us towards racial justice and cultural equity. And since that time, what we've seen is a cycle of crisis. And so we have a crisis that emerges, there's a reaction to it, there's a backlash, period that we're living through now. And then we get to a point of exhaustion. What can we even do about this? Is there anything that we can actually do about this? And that brings us back into a sense of crisis. And so the question becomes, how do we break out of this crisis cycle? And that's what I want to try to talk about today. I want to talk about the facts of resegregation and the facts of what we can understand as a half century of culture wars, because facts are still important, right? Yeah. But I also want to talk about, you can clap if you want to, I think, but I also want to talk about the arts and the culture, right? And how they've helped us to imagine our way out of this type of situation. How artists and people working in the culture and teachers have been able to point the way towards that better nation, towards that better world that we all want. So let's first talk about the importance of culture and the price of the culture wars. Culture is a really important battle in our freedom struggle. It's the realm of ideas, of images, of symbols, of sounds, of stories. And over the last half century, the culture wars have been in effect. And so it's not a diversion. Culture is not a diversion. It's the game itself in many ways. And so they've brought about a coarsening of our lives, a rise in distrust, a deepening of divisions, and the expansion, and this is really important, the expansion of inequality and segregation. Like climate change, seems like culture wars are a permanent feature of our daily lives now. They literally blind us to each other. And in these massive blind spots, inequality sprouts and grows like poison weed. So resegregation is both a product to and a product of the culture wars. And it's odd that in this particular moment we have to remind ourselves why segregation and why fighting segregation matters. It matters because where you live plays a significant role in the quality of education and the quality of food that's available to you, your ability to build wealth, how long you live, whether you have anything to pass on to the next generation. And these are the same arguments that have been made for the better part of the last century, right? But we have to reaffirm them at this particular point. So when we say resegregation, what do we mean? Well, the first thing to note is that some places never desegregated, right? So there's that. But at least a half century ago, there was a consensus that segregation was a problem that we all owed to each other to try to resolve. And so Martin Luther King Jr. put it best in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." In other words, until all of us are free, none of us is free. And so the structures that were put into place to desegregate the schools, to desegregate housing, to desegregate the culture, were put into place at the prodding of this national movement, this national grassroots movement. And now, of course, we are seeing economic and racial inequality growing to crisis proportions. And I want to come back to the numbers of that in a second, right? Again, facts matter, right? And if we're going to have a conversation about how to move through this, we have to start with the same facts. But let's first start with this number, 2042, which is the year that it all goes to hell, right? It's the year that all Americans will be part of a country that's a majority minority, right? In 2023, we're going to be seeing all under the age of 18 reaching that particular point. And if we go back 50 years, much of the politics of the last 50 years has been arranged around the fears of this kind of a change. My good friend Samuel Leem calls this demographobia, the irrational fear of changing demographics, right? But we're seeing folks organizing those fears, not just for the right now, but for the next 50 years. And so this brings us to the most important question of our time, and what I tell my students is going to be one of the most important questions of their time, right up there with the question of how to resolve climate change, right? Which is, if we are all minorities, how do we begin to see ourselves, imagine ourselves as a new majority? And it's a political question, right? Right now, millions of billions of dollars are being put together so political parties can figure out the answer to that particular question. But I think it's bigger than just the electoral political process. This is more properly thought of as a cultural question, and this is where the arts and culture and designers and teachers all come in. And so I imagine that all of us in this room believe in this, the power of art, right? And we believe in art because we believe in life, in all of its variations, in all of its beauty. And I think we also believe, I know that we also believe that the ugliness, the violence of inhumanity can and must be transformed. Some of us believe, maybe all of us believe in this room, that art and culture changes things, right? And that cultural change brings about political change. And so we listen for those rhythm changes, and we're here every day. We show up every day because we try to change those rhythms. And yet we have our doubts, right? We have our doubts when we are asked, what are we actually doing to change things in this moment, right? Is it possible to describe the difference that art makes? Can we quantify what it is that we do? And we're here in Silicon Valley, so we hear this all the time, right? Quantify the change that you're making, right? Give it to me in numbers. Can you graph and chart how you've moved hearts, right? How you've changed the soul of a community. So to believe in the arts is sometimes to have a kind of faith, right? Very near to a religious kind of faith, that sometimes things are just going to be all right, right? Can't tell you why, can't tell you how, it's going to be all right. And yet, throughout history, the arts and culture have brought about revolutions. Not the kind that are measured in death tolls and property damages and fortunes made and fortunes lost. The arts and culture have brought about revolutions of seeing and revolutions of being. And so let's go back to 1952, Ralph Ellison describing the condition that black people and other marginalized people faced as one of invisibility. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. And this for decades was a primary condition for black people, for marginalized people, for women, but we fought through. And we did change things. A decade later, the artists of Spiral, like Norman Lewis, were inspired by the civil rights movement to begin to show new visions of change, right? Imagine new forms of consciousness. And this began to cohere into the Black arts movement, a movement that then intersects with the Chicanx movement, the Native American movement, the Asian American movement, with the women's movement, with the movement for gay liberation. People begin to rethink their identities, their very selves, their communities. And protests break out in the late 1960s and 1970s around the lack of representation of black artists in the museums and in all of the institutions, the high institutions of the arts. There are strikes for visibility, and it calls into question the very role and the very utility of cultural institutions. And so it draws attention to the history of exclusion of images and stories and ideas of marginalized folks, right? And it's astonishing to reflect now on how much has changed and how much has not changed. But artists also begin to organize themselves to be seen on their own terms. So from the 1960s through the 1970s, what we see is the building of community arts organizations, right? The building of teaching artists going into the schools, the building of creative ecosystems that in turn become the basis for the building of a national movement. And these creative ecosystems are allowed to flourish from the 70s into the 80s. They give artists of color and feminists and queers a place to show their work, to experiment, to really build up this national movement that nurtures and incubates artists of color. And here in the Bay Area in 1975, the author Ishmael Reed names this movement multiculturalism, right? And so during the 80s, these artists formed the vanguard of this multicultural uprising. And the idea behind it was very, very simple, but it was radical at the time, right? The US, which had always portrayed itself as a unitary culture, as a monoculture in a way, had never ever been a monoculture, right? That it had always been shaped by people of different backgrounds, of cultures, of faiths, and that this fact in and of itself was nothing to fear. But if fear is what you gotta feel, then as Flavor Flav put it, like, Armageddon's already here, go get a late pass, right? And so at the same time this is happening, and it's still the greatest story ever told, how abandoned, forgotten kids of African descent, right, in New York City, in the Bronx, rise up, create this culture, this movement, build hip hop from the ruins of civil society, a movement that, here we are in its 5th decade, continues to give voice to young people all around the world. And so these were revolutions of being, right? And the artists, the multiculturalists, the hip hoppers are saying, we're here, we've always been here. The only urgency is for you now to open your eyes and see. And so these revolutions also demanded seeing in a new kind of a way, that we see each other in our full humanity, that we recognize each other in our full humanity. So they're revolutions of consciousness as well. And they don't require bloodshed. They only require that we not apologize for our very right to be, right? For us to all, and together and individually, learn how to see each other. And so by the end of the 1970s, the writer Toni K. Bambara had coined a motto of sorts for this movement. She said that the role of an artist is to make the revolution irresistible, right? So the revolution is about seeing difference and moving from seeing difference to seeing equity, justice, and mutuality. And I've been talking about the act of seeing. And I do this deliberately because we now live, as you all know, you all have students, right, in an image culture, right? We live in an era in which the act of seeing has been heightened. And so it helps for us to also take the metaphor of seeing very seriously as well. Difference has been contrasted with this other word, right? Colorblind, as in, I don't see color, I just see you. I just see people, right? And so we've all been taught, and we actually go ahead and teach Martin Luther King every year. We teach his speech at the March on Washington, right? especially the line about him wanting to see his children growing up in a world where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But what's often forgotten, what we often don't teach, are the words that preceded that line, right? In this speech, King praised the new militancy that was rising in Black America. He strongly condemned police brutality. And these are the lines, of course, that are not remembered so much every January. And he said, the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. And he said all of this before he said the words, I have a dream today. And so this is Dr. King in all of his fullness, right? Recognizing Dr. King in all of his humanity, right? The King who believed that an act of protest was a creative act, that we could not wait, that until America came to address its shameful legacy of slavery and genocide and racial discrimination and segregation and inequality, a legacy that continued to reproduce itself from generation to generation, that the country would be shaken by the whirlwinds of protest. And so in that moment, Martin Luther King was arguing that we need to be color conscious, specifically to the way that notions of color and race have been used to segregate and separate, and indeed consign some people to premature death, to create and reinforce inequity. To be colorblind was to be complicit with the forces that created inequity and injustice, that made mutuality impossible. And so, if anything, colorblindness to King was the very distant horizon of change, right? But we had a long way to get there. And so King was offering a much different vision than is replicated every year for us to be able to try to reach that horizon. And so now when we think about racial inequity and justice in the US, many times we've been conditioned to think that the best way to see difference is to pretend that we ignore it, to be colorblind. And I think many are well-meaning in this, right? If we know what the history is of thinking about the way that race has been used and seeing race has been used, then what we ought to do is just blind ourselves to that, right? But the best way to change something is to see something, recognize it, and then imagine how to alter it. We never change anything by ignoring it. And so let me explain this another way. In all of our lives, we learn from an early age to be able to see difference, right? We learn to tell the difference between ourselves and others. When we're kids, difference is difference. And it also may be the beginning of something else. Learning to see difference might be the beginning of empathy, which in turn produces the possibility of community. But as we get older, we humans have sometimes begun to attach meaning to difference that's not so neutral. Notions of superiority and inferiority. We become aware of how difference has been sorted into these vast systems, historical systems of freedom and slavery, of commitment and neglect, of investment and abandonment, of mobility and containment. But then rather than confront these systems, we might choose to draw a veil over these systems, pretend that they don't even exist. And so racism is supported by a specific kind of refusal. It's a denial of empathy. It's a mask of blindness. And this is how inequity comes to be reproduced in every generation. And so inequity shows up in three ways: representation, access, and power. Representation on stage and before the camera, yes, but also, as Solange put it, right, a seat at the table, right? Access to institutions of power and advancement, but also access to tradition, ways, and practices that have helped us all to survive, right? The power to raise one's voice and be heard, but also, importantly, the power to be able to make decisions, to have agency. And so representation, access, and power show up as distributed unequally, right? Inequity hides within our scope of vision, but many of us choose to remain blind to it. And so here's where art becomes a remedy. It allows us to be able to see again, to close the gaps again. In its mimicry of life, great art helps to close the distance between the self and the other. It helps us to come together. Another way to say this is that through art, we learn once again how to experience empathy. And empathy is the necessary first step towards equity. Equity means making the values, the pleasures, the ways of knowing and being that the arts and culture enable to be available to all. It means fair representation, inclusion, and access. It also fundamentally means shared power, comes down to forming relationships between ourselves and others that are not based in domination and exploitation and extraction, but in exchange and trust. So if empathy builds the possibility of community, it also creates the possibility of equity. And now in recent years, the arts world has been pushed to deal with what it euphemizes as issues of diversity, right? From Oscar's So White to all kinds of controversy over the content of plays and paintings and performances. And yet this word diversity, which once used to be radical, has become so toothless. First thing to say is diversity is just a fact. Facts matter, right? Climate change is a fact. Diversity is a fact. And yet leaders find ways to say that they believe in both, even as they're reversing course as fast as they can. See, diversity means nothing without equity. So we can comfort ourselves with a picture of diversity while tolerating the reality of rising inequality and resegregation. And so what the movement for Black Lives and other justice movements have intended to force back to the center of the discussion are not issues of diversity, but issues of equity. And so this is in part what equity looks like, right? New faces, new people, new stories, and the revolution is ongoing. We've seen over the past century, the moment at which these revolutions of seeing and being have been in motion, the reality of growing inequality and resegregation. And so if there's anything that history has taught us is that empathy is not enough. We also need to act, right? These revolutions are incomplete. Multiculturalism changed the way that we see each other, but it didn't go far enough. It told us what we couldn't say to each other, but it didn't tell us what we have to say to each other, right? And so this is a part of the process right now, finding the common conversation. And if we take revolution not as an end, but as a process, then perhaps it always is going to be incomplete. But what we can say right now is that we're very, very far from where we need to be. So let's go back to the numbers. We can talk about housing segregation. And we live in the Bay Area. So all of these facts that we present here, stunning as they are, devastating as they are, shouldn't surprise us. Displacement, of course, is a story behind these numbers. And the people who are displaced have to go somewhere, right? Oakland's now the 5th highest rental market in the country, and the domino effect of displacement continues. People in Oakland move further out into the suburbs, the edges of the Bay, right? To Antioch, to Oakley, to Stockton. And so when we think about the question of displacement, even the word gentrification is too small. It talks about the wealth that's moving in to the wealthy cities, but it doesn't talk about the disappearing of low-income folks, of folks of color who have to move somewhere, right? So gentrification is just a part of this larger type of thing that's going on, which is resegregation, right? And we can move then to school segregation. One of the things that stuns me and scares me is that the peak of school desegregation happened in 1989, right? In 2010, and we'll get new numbers for this soon, 80% of Latino and 74% of Black K-12 students attended majority non-white schools. And the average white student attended a school that was 75% white. And this mirrors the fact that the average white person lives in a neighborhood that's 77% white. And so imagine this playing out over the next 50 years, right? You've got the most diverse generation of Americans yet to be born, right? And yet segregation is now rampant and expanding. I don't need to go too much further for us to kind of see the kind of disaster that could create. And so let's go back to the deepest inequity of all, the fundamental question of life expectancy. These are the latest numbers that we have for life expectancy for different races by gender. And the long-term impact of inequity is that, in general, Native people and African Americans live shorter lives than other groups. What we know is that a non-Hispanic Black male can expect to live 7 years less than the average American. And that's why we have to say Black Lives Matter. So what can we do in this moment? As people who believe in the power of art, as teachers, we grind it out daily, right? As artists, as teachers, we take care of these students who show up hungry and homeless. We try to model the terms of building community to our young folks. What we're working against daily is the reproduction of these systems of inequality. And the tools that we have are art, our engagement, our inspiration to creativity. For me, the work of the Mural Music and Arts Project in East Palo Alto has been really influential in thinking about how the work we do can have a long-term impact. MAP's been around in East Palo Alto for almost 20 years now. And what we found is that they've sustained and developed an entire generation of young people through arts and hip-hop education. And so instead of reproducing inequality, MAP has aimed to build a creative ecosystem that would give young people a voice and a means through which to become active in their own community. So East Palo Alto is facing an intense wave of gentrification and displacement. The median price of a home in East Palo Alto in 2012, about 5 years ago, was $271,000. It's now over $800,000 in 5 years. 42% of the young people in the Ravenswood School District are deemed homeless. More than 2 in 5 students. And so what can an arts organization do in this kind of a space and time when things are happening so quickly? Well, it gives them a place to be, a home, right? To be able to be creative. It stabilizes them, right? And that has a halo effect. If one student is stabilized, then the students around that student can be stabilized as well. And since MAP has been in the community over the last 15 years, right, 15 to 20 years, it's been able to build an infrastructure for these young folks to be able to find their voices and then to become engaged in their communities. And so as they find their voices, they engage with the elders in their community, and they're able to form a unified voice for the kinds of things that need to happen in the community. And so an entire generation of activists have been born out of the arts, not because they said we were going to make this an activist type of program, an organizing type of program, but by the simple fact of giving young folks a tool to be able to express themselves, right? And so MAP actually has been funded in part by the very tech companies that are moving into the neighborhoods, right? By Facebook, by Spotify, by Twitter. And the young people get together every year and they learn their skills on how to make music. And one year they decided that the theme of that year was going to be talking about gentrification. And so they gave a performance at the Warfield to all these Twitter execs and Facebook execs and Spotify execs, in which they talked about the impact that gentrification was having on their very neighborhood. My point is that creative ecosystems have impacts far beyond the immediate, right? MAP stabilize young people who are living through these difficult conditions, but over the long run, it's been able to build a more stable community that can advocate for what it needs. And so Facebook last year, as a result of this intergenerational organizing that's been happening in East Palo Alto, agreed to give $20 million to support the building of affordable housing in East Palo Alto. So this brings us to the work of the late, great Grace Lee Boggs and her thinking about the idea of revolution. And we often think about revolution as something that's won in bloodshed, through war, through the violent seizure of power, the replacing of one group in charge with another group in charge. But as Grace has put it, the next revolution might be better thought of as advancing humankind, these are her words, advancing humankind to a new stage of consciousness, creativity, and social and political responsibility. What her revolution will require us to do is to move away from finding new ways to divide and rule and to consign some folks to death, and instead pivot to life, to honor and transform ourselves and our relationships to each other. She insists that we rethink how to live together. And so again, if we're all minorities, how do we begin to imagine a new majority? So we started with Donald Trump, and now we have to end with Beyonce. So those of you who know Lemonade, you know the story, right? It's about infidelity, about promises broken. It's about the betrayal of a marriage. When it was released, there was all kinds of gossip folks saying, oh, this is all about B and J. And this explains what was happening in the elevator when Solange was beating up on Jay. All these kinds of things. But what if we thought about this record and this album, not through the filter of gossip page columnists, but through the filter of seeing it through a struggle for equity and justice? What might she be telling us? Well, Lemonade begins, the movie begins, with Beyonce refusing her gaze. She won't allow you to see her because she's hurt, because of the betrayal, because of the harm done to her relationship and to her. Can't see her. And so she moves to the grief, the trauma in stages. There's the anger, which is a kind of release, right? And then there's the bat, there's the explosions, there's the hot sauce thing going on, right? There's all of this stuff. It's cathartic. We can understand this type of stuff. We can relate to this type of stuff. But then there's the apathy and the emptiness, the despair, the depression. So finally, she needs to turn away from this cycle of pain and revenge. And she asks herself, what is my home? Who and what makes home for me? How do I come home? How do I make a home that can include all those who I love, even those who have hurt me? And here's where she begins to return the gaze. Here's where the healing begins. And she begins to understand herself in place, in geography, in the South, like her family and her legacy of the family, her place in history. And suddenly this story that's been about a solitary broken relationship becomes something bigger. The process of her finding redemption becomes something that reaches the level of the social, right? And so what if we thought about Lemonade not just as this thing about J and B, or instead of thinking about it as about them too, but as a map for reconciliation, as transformative justice, where fixing relationships that have gone wrong become a metaphor for social transformation. The great thinker Robin D.G. Kelley talks about James Baldwin, and he says that his most revolutionary and misunderstood idea is that love is the ultimate form of agency. And so Kelley wrote this of Baldwin, but he could have written about Beyonce or Kendrick Lamar, that love begins with self-love and then extends to, quote, loving ourselves as Black people. It meant making love the motivation for making revolution. It meant envisioning a society where everyone is embraced, where there is no oppression, where every life is valued, even those who once may have been our oppressors. To love all, Kelley wrote, is to fight relentlessly to end exploitation and oppression everywhere, even on behalf of those who think they hate us. And this is a huge challenge, right? Restoring the wholeness of those who have been harmed. Transforming our relations to each other to be more expansive and generous and equal and joyful and mutual. The question is, can we make this happen through the work that we do? And I think these are the questions that we're struggling to figure out right now everywhere, in our schools, in our streets. We're in a moment in which politics feels broken. We have a system that brings us no justice and no peace. We feel alone, isolated, bound by a hopeless reality. Politics isn't rising to meet our ideals. 2/3 of Americans believe that dreamers should not be deported. 2/3 believe that we have to have stronger gun control laws. 2/3 believe that the country's headed in the wrong direction. Yet politics continues to push us apart. It continues to be about competition, about advantage, about domination. A world in which there's no pretense of higher values, there's only power and a cycle of harm and revenge. A world segregated and at war. And young people have been showing us that they know where all of this leads. And so in this context, the question becomes, what does it mean to dream again? What does it mean to imagine a world in which segregation and violence and war are not the answers, but the questions to be solved? How do we as teachers empower our students to take it into their hands to dream and imagine solutions to the problems that we have left for them? What's clear is that in this moment, we can't remain on the fence. We can't be bystanders. In this moment, privilege shows up as disengagement, in the refusal to see, in the refusal to take a stand, in the refusal to show up. Instead, we want to approach the world woke, with eyes wide open, seeing the humanity of each other, reaching out to each other, figuring out how to move forward together. Art reflects the infinite ways that we navigate life, right? It's about finding feeling in the multitude of variations that we experience in ourselves, with each other, and in our world. And so as artists, as teachers, as people living in community in this moment, we have to choose. We have to choose. So here's the artist, Ana Teresa Fernandez, Bay Area artist, on the beach on the border that separates Tijuana from San Diego. And she's asking us to think about what it means to dream again, to dream of desegregation, to rely upon our powers of imagination to create a better world. What did they say at the end of the Black Panther movie? I hope I'm not spoiling it for anybody. Am I? Everybody seen it? Okay, cool. No? Okay. I'll move on then. Well, what I want to say is that this is our time to be able to do that. And we have to arm our students, not with guns, but with the capacity to build a better world. And in this moment of danger and division, the revolution is still there to be made, to make and to bring about freedom for all. So thank you very much.